So you've probably heard the phrase wet in wet watercolor, and if not, you certainly will, because this is an incredibly useful way to paint. It is unique to watercolor in a lot of ways. I would say watercolor and transparent inks have this ability where other paints don't really have the same type of characteristic. What we're relying on is the fact that watercolor paint likes water. Watercolor paint will leap into areas of increased water. Watercolor paint will flow into the puddle naturally. So I'm going to show you what that looks like and paint a puddle. This puddle is in the shape of a heart, but it could be in any shape, and it could be in no shape whatsoever. I could just spray or wet the entire sheet of paper. When you see artists start a painting like this is because they're going to leverage the properties of wet in wet. So next to my plain water shape, I'm now going to paint a shape in a nice medium strength wash. I'm echoing my heart shape and repeating it. Notice that these shapes are very close together on the page, and I do recommend practicing this exact exercise, doing this experiment to see what it feels like and looks like for yourself. So I can fill this shape in with nice, bright, intense color, and then use my brush to butt up against the shape of my puddle. Just knit those things together, create a channel, create an opportunity for paint and water to flow between these shapes. As long as I'm working quickly and everything is actually wet and fresh, you will see what you see here, which is that this new introduction of color, this influx, will flow across that join, and the two shapes will start to weld together. This transition, where we put down plain water, add paint, and let that paint naturally and organically spread throughout the shape, this is called charging, this approach to using wet in wet. And if I'm concerned that my first shape rather, the one that's painted as a puddle, doesn't fill in, I can easily just add some additional color, whether I choose to use more of the same scarlet or change it up. In this case, I've changed it up, added some yellow ochre, and my initial heart shape starts to have a bit of color personality. These colors blend naturally on their own. I can intensify this color by adding a little bit more of it. And again, as long as I'm working quickly and everything is wet and reasonably new to the paper, hasn't had a lot of time to start sinking in, I will get smooth transitions between different areas of different colors. So this is an example of wet in wet painting and leveraging the property of watercolor, wherein our paint just likes water. It likes to be around it. It wants to move towards it. We can start with areas of color rather than areas of clean water. So again, I'm going to paint a heart shape. And this time, to change things up, I'm going to use my yellow ochre as my base color. Now, yellow ochre is an earth-based pigment, and it's a heavier pigment, so it settles in the water down to the bottom of the water droplet and sinks into the paper more readily than other pigments. And it is kind of sluggish. It's not a pigment that likes to jump around and leap into water as readily as some others. So I'm going to paint a base layer using this particular pigment. And now I'm going to add some additional pigments to this heart shape. Right now it's yellow, I want it to be green, so I'm adding some phthalo green while everything is still wet. Phthalo green is the opposite of that kind of pigment. It likes to move in water, it's lighter, it doesn't sink down to the bottom of the water as readily, it stains, it flows, it just has very different characteristics from the earth pigment that I've added. And I've added a little bit of phthalo blue to this as well, just to give it some character and dimension. I'm working these colors together with my brush a bit just because my yellow ochre needs a little bit of a push to get moving. But as this shape dries, what we're going to see is an irregular, variegated, blended but not completely blended mixture of green. At a glance, we'll read that color as green overall, but it becomes an interesting green with a lot of character, a lot of dynamics. It's not a flat color. This is something that is so incredibly powerful, and the sooner you start practicing this approach to blending colors, the more pop, presence, and dynamic interest you're going to have in your painting from the outset. Here I'm using the opposite approach. I'm adding my staining, light, traveling colors, my phthalos first, and adding a little bit of my yellow ochre to the mix. And I think that this actually gives a better result. How do I know this? Simply because I've done it both ways. Now I have both examples drying in front of my nose, and I can look down and see which way do I like this better. Do I start with my yellow ochre, or do I start with my phthalo blue and green? You might prefer things the other way around. This shows the value of experimentation and the idea that it's really helpful to try something multiple different ways, change the order that we add colors to our mixtures, and we actually get different colors. We don't get identical colors. This is very different from mixing paint in gouache or acrylic, right? We mix any two parts of a yellow and a blue, mix them thoroughly enough, and we're going to get more or less the same color. But in watercolor, change the order that you mix your paints into the mix, and you can get extremely different results. Here, I'm adding some blue, painting out a very similar heart with a little bit of yellow ochre in it, but what I want to show is that we can also take a different approach, work backwards from my first example. Now I'm going to paint a heart that has a strong, brightly colored wash, rinse my brush, and make an addition of clean water that touches my painted area. As long as all of this painting is recent and fresh and new to the paper, what's going to happen is I'm going to get flow, I'm going to get interchange, and I'm going to get a smooth transition as my color bleeds out into my new area of plain water wash. This shows you how the paint literally wants to be closer to areas of more water. As soon as a channel has been opened up by my brush, I'm able to treat these two shapes as a single shape, manipulate paint, extend edges, and make changes using just plain water on my brush. So this is something to think about. Are there ways that you could leverage this quality of this paint? There probably are. You can probably think of many. Either way, this type of exercise, again, merits some practice and some exploration. Another thing that Wet in Wet can do is change the nature of edges. So here I have a shape that has two hard edges. As I paint down plain water and open up some communication between one edge and this area of plain water, one of these edges will soften. Same thing from the bottom up. As I open up that communication with my brush, just by making those things touch each other, one of the edges changes from a hard edge to a soft edge. And of course, by adding paint to wet paper, I will have a shape that bleeds, is amorphous, and has lots of bleeding transitions with soft edges all around. These are just some of the things that we can accomplish with a wet in wet approach, but hopefully this gives you some understanding of the kinds of things you can expect to see when we talk about painting wet in wet.